Lecture 2, The Metaphor.
Ladies and gentlemen, as the subject of today's talk is a metaphor, I shall begin by a metaphor. And this first of the many metaphors I shall try to recall comes from the Far East, from China. If I am not mistaken, the Chinese call the world the 10,000 things, or, this depends on the taste and fancy of the translator, the 10,000 beings. Now, we may accept, I suppose, this very conservative estimate, 10,000, for of course there are more than 10,000 ants, than 10,000 men, than 10,000 hopes, fears, or nightmares in the world. But if we accept this number, 10,000, and if we think that all metaphors are made by linking two different things together, then had we time enough, we might work out an almost unbelievable sum of possible metaphors. I have forgotten my algebra, but I think that the sum should be 10,000 multiplied by 99,999 and so on. Of course, the sum of possible combinations is not endless, but it staggers the imagination. And so we might be led to think, why on earth should poets all over the world and all over time be using the same stock metaphors when there are so many possible combinations? The Argentine poet Lugones wrote way back in the year 1909 that he thought that poets were always using the same metaphors and that he would try his hand at discovering new metaphors for the moon. And in fact, he concocted many hundreds of them. He also said, this is in the foreword to a book called Lunario Sentimental, that every word is a dead metaphor. This statement is, of course, a metaphor. And yet I think that we all feel the difference between dead and living metaphors. If we take any good etymological dictionary, I am thinking of my old unknown friend, Dr. Skeet, and if we look up any word, we are sure to find a metaphor tucked away somewhere. For example, the word threat meant, you can find this in the very first lines of Beowulf, threat meant an angry mob. But now the word is given to the effect and not to the cause. Then we have the word king. King was originally König, and this meant a man who stood for the king, for the people. So etymologically, king, kinsman, and gentleman are the same word. And yet, if I say the king sat in his counting house, counting out his money, we don't think of the word king as being a metaphor. In fact, if we go in for abstract thinking, we have to forget that words were metaphors. We have to forget, for example, that in the word consider there is a suggestion of astrology. Because in consider, we're thinking of making a horoscope. So What is important about the metaphor, I should say, is the fact of its being felt by the reader or the hearer as a metaphor. And I will confine this talk to metaphors that are felt as metaphors by the reader, not to such words as king or threat, and we might go on, perhaps forever. In the first case, I would like to take some stock patterns of metaphor. I use the word pattern because the metaphors I will quote will be to the imagination quite different, and yet to the logical thinker they would be almost the same, so that we might speak of them as equations. And let us take the first that comes to my mind. Let us take the stock comparison, the time-honored comparison of eyes and stars, or inversely, of stars and eyes. And the first example I remember comes from the Greek anthology, and I think Plato is supposed to have written it. The verses, I have no Greek, run more or less as follows. I wish I were the night, and so that I might watch your sleep with 1,000 eyes. Now here, of course, what we feel is the tenderness of the lover. What we feel is his wish to be able to see his beloved from many points at once. But we feel the tenderness behind those verses. Now let us take another and less illustrious example. The stars look down. Now here, of course, we have, if we take theological thinking seriously, here, of course, we have the same metaphor. And yet, the effect on our imagination is quite different, because the stars look down do not make us think of tenderness. They rather give the idea of generations and of generations of men toiling on, and the stars look down with a kind of lofty indifference. And we'll take a different example. This is one of the verses, one of the stanzas that have most struck me. They come from a poem of Chesterton called A Second Childhood. And therein we read, "But I shall not be too old to see in almost night arise a cloud that is larger than the world, and a monster made of eyes." Not a monster full of eyes. We know those monsters from the Revelation of St. John. But this is far more awful, a monster made of eyes, as if his eyes were the living tissue of him. Well, now